I want to start today with a question, and I want you to really sit with it before we talk about the answer. If building the salon you've always imagined required you to stop being the best service provider in it, would you do it? Because here's something that I had to learn the hard way. The thing that got you here is not the thing that gets you there. So, the talent that built your clientele, the skill that earned your reputation, the work ethic that made you someone's that clients would wait weeks to see, all of that is real, all of that matters, and none of it is enough to build $1 million+ salon. Not because it isn't valuable, but because $1 million salon isn't built by one person's hands. It's built by a leader's vision. And those are two completely different things. I know this because I lived on the wrong side of that line for longer than I'd like to admit. I was standing behind the chair, booked back to back all day for weeks out. And so by every external measure, I was winning. And I was also completely stuck because here's what was actually true. Everything in that salon ran through me. Every question, every decision, every problem, every dollar. I wasn't running a salon. I was the salon, or the salon was running me, really. And the terrifying part was if I got sick, we didn't just lose my productivity, we lost everything, revenue, momentum, morale, gone. And that was the moment that I understood something that changed my entire trajectory. What I had built was not a business. It was a very expensive job because a business can run without you. And what I had could not. And the reason it couldn't was this. I had spent years becoming the best service provider I could be, but I had never spent a single intentional full day on becoming the best owner I could be. And that moment cracked something open for me. And today, Jen and I want to crack it open for you too. So let's talk about the 9 shifts you can make to start right away.
Yeah. So here's the truth that will either set you free or actually sting a little, depending on where you are today. A service provider gets paid for what she does, an owner gets paid for what she builds. And that's not just a mindset distinction, it's an entirely different operating system. When you're still thinking like a service provider, the questions in your head probably sound something like this, like, how can I stay busier? Or like, how can I make more money behind the chair? Or like, how can I fit one more client in today? Those are the right questions for a service provider. But when you shift into owner thinking, everything changes. It's like, how do I help my team not only be busier, but stay busier? Or how do I help others create more income? Or even how do I build capacity beyond myself? Here's the math no one talks about. A service provider has a ceiling. It's called hours. There are only so many of them, and you're already using most of them. But an owner doesn't have that ceiling. An owner's capacity is limited only by the size of the team she can lead. The first shift isn't about what you do, it's about who you decide to become.
I love that. It's about who you decide to become. And Jen, I just realized earlier I said there's going to be 9. There's actually only 7. So we don't have to make up the bonus 2, but let's talk about number 2, which is to build people before you build revenue. Most owners are obsessed with numbers. Probably don't even know what they're looking at until all of a sudden it maybe clicks, but they're looking at revenue, retail, bookings, profit percentages, and those things matter deeply. But here's what I've seen over and over again coaching salons across the world. Revenue follows people, not the other way around. The salons that stay stuck are constantly trying to fix their numbers. And the salons that grow are consistently developing the people who create the numbers. So think about what a fully booked service provider looks like when she's operating at her best. She communicates, she builds genuine trust, she recommends services and products naturally because she knows what her guests actually need. She retains clients, she pre-books almost automatically. you know and that service provider, whether it's a male or a female, isn't creating those results by accident. She's been developed, and that development is the owner's job. And million-dollar salons are talent development organizations. They don't just provide services, they build professionals. Every system, every meeting, every piece of training inside your salon should answer one question: how do we help our people become more valuable? Because when your people grow, your salon grows every single time.
Lindsay, we hear this from salon owners constantly. It's like, my team just isn't motivated. They're not consistent. I can't get them to care. And I want to say this with love, with all the love that I have actually, is that if your team is inconsistent, it is probably not a motivation problem. It's actually a systems problem. Think about good old Chick-fil-A, for example. Like, you walk into a location in, let's say, Kansas, where Lindsay lives, or Florida, or anywhere in between, and the experience is remarkably similar, right? The greeting, the speed, the friendliness. They are not relying on motivation, they are relying on systems. Now, think about your salon. How do you answer the phone? How do you welcome a guest in? How do you conduct a consultation, recommend a product, pre-book, follow up after a visit? Every single one of those touch points should have a system. Not because your team cannot think for themselves, but because a system creates predictability, right? Predictability creates trust, and that trust creates growth. And growth actually is what creates freedom. That's the chain, and it all starts with a system.
Yeah, so that was shift number 3, which is systems beat motivation. Shift 4 is retention is your real growth engine. So here is the shift that changes the math more than almost anything else. Most salon owners are out there chasing new clients. They think that ads and promotions and social media campaigns and referral programs, they think that that's going to, if all of it is pointed at getting more people through the door, that will solve all their problems. And hey, that's not wrong. But before you spend another dollar on acquisition, I want you to look hard at your retention numbers, because that math is pretty revealing. So imagine this: 1,000 guests walk through your door this year. If half of them never came back, you're starting over. You know, every January is year 1. You're running as hard as you can just to stay in place. So, a salon focused on retention is building something completely different, something that compounds. So, the easiest client to book is the one already sitting in your chair. The easiest service to sell is the one someone already trusts you to perform. And the most powerful referral you will ever receive comes from a guest who left feeling genuinely transformed. And this is why we say that 4 visits often creates a client for life. On the first visit, they're evaluating everything. They're watching, wondering if they made the right choice. And on that second visit, they're starting to settle in. They're beginning to trust. And on that third visit, it starts to feel like home to them. And on that fourth visit, they're yours and they're telling their friends. So every visit deepens the relationship, and every visit compounds the loyalty. So before you run another new client promotion, ask yourself one question: are we doing everything possible to make sure the guests we already earned want to come back? Because retention is not a tactic, it is the ultimate growth strategy.
Yeah. All right. So let's move on to shift 5, which is where we create leaders not followers. I want to share something that I've sat with for a long time. And it's that there's a version of ownership that looks incredibly impressive from the outside. The owner is involved in everything. She knows
Mhm.
every client, every team member's schedule, every issue the moment it surfaces. She is the answer to every question. And from the inside, that feels like a great leader, but it isn't. What it actually is a bottleneck. When every decision runs through one person, that person becomes the ceiling of the business. And when that person is you, you have quietly made yourself the lid on your own salon's growth. We've watched owners work themselves to complete depletion, doing everything right, and still wonder, like, why isn't my salon growing? And the answer almost every time is that the salon has grown as far as one person could carry it. But the $1,000,000 salon owner understands that her job is not to have all the answers. Whew, thank goodness, right? Her job is just to develop people who can find them, not followers who wait for directions, but leaders who can think, who can solve, who can carry culture and coach others. When that shift happens, everything changes. The team becomes stronger, accountability becomes peer driven, and the owner finally gets space to work on the business instead of constantly reacting inside of it. The goal was never to be the hero. The goal is to build a team of heroes.
I love that. Let's talk about shift 6, which is culture is not an accident. So I just want to say something plainly. Culture doesn't happen to salons. Salons happen to culture. Every day in every conversation and every decision you either make or avoid making, your culture is being built or eroded. There's no neutral ground. And if you're not intentional about what you're creating, you will get whatever forms by default. So here's the truth I come back to again and again. Culture is what gets rewarded and repeated. That's it. So if gossip gets tolerated, gossip becomes culture. If excuses go unchallenged, excuses become culture. If entitlement is accepted, entitlement becomes culture. But flip it. If growth gets celebrated out loud, growth becomes culture. If someone goes above and beyond and that gets noticed and named, excellence becomes culture. If your team sees that service actually matters here, service becomes culture. So the strongest salons I've ever been inside share one thing. They are relentlessly intentional about who they are. So everyone knows the mission, the standards, what's expected and what isn't tolerated. Culture is not what you put on a sign in your back room. Culture is what happens on a Tuesday afternoon when no one is watching, And in $1,000,000 salons, the right things are happening on that Tuesday because the culture requires it.
Mhm. So true. All right. So we move on to shift 7, which is to think beyond revenue. The owners who ultimately build the biggest businesses are not the ones most obsessed with revenue. They're actually obsessed with value. They made a quiet but fundamental shift in the question they live inside of every day. Not how do I make more money, but how do I create more value? Because value is the engine. Value creates revenue. Value creates referrals. Value creates loyalty and opportunity that you never had to go looking for. And in the beauty industry, this isn't just, business philosophy. It's actually the literal truth of what we do. People do not walk through your door because they need shorter hair. Like, they truly come to you because they want to feel confident walking into something important. They come because something in their life is changing and they want the outside to reflect what they're becoming on the inside. They come because they want to feel like themselves again. We deliver confidence, we deliver identity, we deliver transformation. And when your team understands that, everything shifts. You are no longer a service business. You're in the transformation business. And the market for transformation is unlimited.
Yeah, that's so good. The market for transformation is unlimited. If I had to put everything we've shared today into a single framework, it would be this. $1,000,000 salon is built on 5 pillars. People, systems, leadership, retention, and culture. People grow, systems create consistency, leadership creates scale, retention builds momentum, and culture protects everything. So if you miss one of those pillars, growth gets hard, but if you strengthen all five, and what felt impossible starts to feel inevitable. But here's what I really want to leave you with today. The goal was never really $1 million. The goal is becoming the kind of leader who is capable of building that. Because once you become that person, the number is just a byproduct. The salon grows because you grew. The team grows because you grew. The opportunity expands because you did first. This isn't a business problem you're solving, it's a becoming problem. Your salon can only grow to the level of the leader building it. So this week, don't ask what your salon needs. Ask yourself who you need to become next.
And if today stirred something in you, that feeling is worth following. We have a challenge coming up that was built exactly for the owner who is ready to make that shift. It's one day, it's intensive, and it will change how you see everything. You can find all the details at salonsuccesssecretschallenge.com.
Yeah, we'd love to see you there. Until next time, remember this: you are not called to build a busy salon. You are called to build something that outlives the work you do behind the chair. Let's go.